kind of weird to talk about this game in particular, since Blood Omen, the one I'm covering right now, the first game in the series, is a little bit different from basically every other game in the series. I've actually heard this game compared to Zelda, although I'm not sure I go with that, but I'll talk about gameplay in a minute. But compared to everything else, which tends to be more the usual third-person perspective thing, I've actually heard some people theorize that the Demon's Souls and Dark Souls series was actually inspired by, in some parts, by the Legacy of Kain series. I'm not sure how true that is, of course. That might just be rumor mongering. But it was interesting going back through this, for reasons that I will, of course, get into in a moment. But let's talk about the first thing that really is important when it comes to Legacy of Kain. So, first of all, let me go ahead and say that I do recommend the Legacy of Kain series. It's been a long time since I've gone through the series. My friend Pax is a huge fan of it. And, of course, I mean, Simon Templeman is amazing. The voice acting in general is very top-notch in this series. And the storytelling and writing is very, very well done. It is extremely well written and extremely well voice acted. There's some other flaws with it, but those are both awesome things. But the problem with the franchise is the fact that it's dead. No pun intended. What I mean by that is similar to several other franchises I could mention, like the Mana series, or the Mega Man series, or the Parasite Eve series, or, I mean, there's actually a huge list. I'm not going to go into it. There's a huge list of franchises. I've talked about this on stream, especially with my viewers many times, about franchises that have just died. That the makers of have basically abandoned and said, nope, we're not going to do anything with it again. And most of those series have stayed dead, and probably will stay dead. And the Legacy of Kain is likely amongst those. Now, I bring this up for two reasons. One, because it's a damn shame. And it's one of the reasons why I guess three reasons. Because the second reason is, it's hard for me to recommend getting into the Legacy of Kain series if you've never played it, because of the fact that it's an unfinished story. It's like me recommending, well, to use the Mega Man parallel, that you should play the ZX series or the Z series. Both of those series are good, but then they just stop. In fact, they basically stop on a cliffhanger. Just like Legacy of Kain does, with Defiance. It's like, alright, we now finally know who the real villain is, we finally know what's going on and what's been behind everything. It's time to go take him out! The end! And then, there was supposed to be more, and there never has been. Now, I know some people would argue it technically because they say that there was that one little multiplayer-only focused game that had no story and no significance to the series setting in any real significant way, but even that fails as a technically because of the fact that that game has since been discontinued. So in every way, even ignoring technicalities, the Legacy of Kain series is dead. That brings me to my third reason why I bring this up. Because of the fact that it kind of colors my own impressions of the game. I've never really had a large desire to go replay through the series, to be completely honest. And that is why. Because for the same reason I've actually never replayed the ZX games. I'll keep using the Mega Man parallel. Because I've never replayed ZX or ZX Advent. Because I know it just stops. Because I know the story just... And it's like... I know we all, to use a weird parallel, I know we all, well, some of us say that Mass Effect 3 was bad, or its ending was bad, or it was great, it was amazing. We all have our own opinions of Mass Effect 3. But for those of you who think Mass Effect 3 was bad, imagine how much worse it would be if Mass Effect 2 was the last Mass Effect game, ever. That there was no 3, that there was no Andromeda, there's no books, there's no comics, that the franchise just stopped after 2. That's kind of what's happened here with Legacy of Kain. Yeah. And they were right going to the finale. The other thing I want to talk about before we jump into this is the idea of proper remakes. Also, as an aside, just to make it clear, I'm only really talking about the first game. Obviously, I know a bit about the whole franchise. So, Raziel, for example... Oh, by the way, I'm probably going to be terrible about pronunciations. Raziel is not someone... Even though he is actually present for several of the events that happen in this game, time travel... I'm not actually going to be talking about him that much. There's really no need to with regards to the first game. So, there's another barrier to entry for enjoying the Legacy of Kain series, and it's one of the barriers to entry I hear referenced most often in the Kingdom Hearts franchise. The story is very complex. It is very convoluted. I would say it's not overly convoluted. It does make sense. I can't personally think of any major plot holes throughout the course of the Legacy Kain series. I'm not saying there aren't any, just no major ones that come to my mind immediately. And that is one of the benefits of the well-written thing that I mentioned earlier. Ugh, so, that being said, though, some people just don't like that kind of complicated storytelling. This is a game in which time is treated with very unique rules. I mentioned time travel earlier. The way it kind of works, there's even time travel in this game, in the first game. Basically, the way time travel works is you can't really alter history. It's all just one linear thing, unless a loophole is found. And there's a couple of ways to do this loophole, but the most common one is the two things in the same place at the same time loophole, and that kind of makes Raziel a walking loophole by definition. But so in this case, making sure that the sword was there for when Kain took down William, for example, ensured that a loophole was found so that time could be altered. And because basically it's described as the fact that the universe hates paradoxes and will do anything it can to fix that situation. To my knowledge, there's only 4 major paradoxes created throughout the course, the 4 times at which time is altered. And the way they present it in this particular game is if time is altered, it's altered. There's no multiple timelines. There's only one timeline. And if it is changed, it's changed. This is actually kind of funny considering what Mobius does in this game. He effectively destroys his own past, 50 years of it, in order to ensure that it never happens. On purpose. He arranges a trap for his past self to complete, knowing his past self will know what his present self knows. And think about that for a moment. Just think about that for a second. That's the kind of game this is. And this is the first game. This isn't really getting that complicated yet. Excuse me. Let's talk about gameplay, though. Let's go ahead and jump into that before I go too much further into the story. Because some people, not calling anyone out, some people call me a bully for this, which is ridiculous, but I do want to defend myself because the reason I didn't really talk about gameplay in the Persona 4 and a couple of other ruminations I've done semi-recently is the fact that I found the gameplay to be good, just not something I enjoyed, right? It's the coffee thing all over again. Persona 4 is the perfect example of that. The gameplay was actually quite serviceable and functional in that game. It just wasn't something I enjoyed. So there's nothing I can comment on there. I could say exactly what I just said. Basically, the gameplay was coffee, but that's a meaningless statement at that point. There's no reason to make it. And I can't, give constructive criticism on the gameplay, because I have none. It was good. There's no need to change it, just to service a completely different audience, me in this case. This game, by contrast, does not have good gameplay. This game, oh my god. This game desperately needs a proper remake, in my opinion. This game could very much benefit from having someone go back and polish up the gameplay, polish up the mechanics. You know what? I mentioned earlier that people always talk about this game as if it's a Zelda clone. I don't actually agree with that. I think it's a Diablo 1 clone, even though it's top-down instead of the isometric. That's really the only major difference. It's slow, combat is slow, the effects are kind of dull, in some cases it's hard to tell where you're going. The whole thing feels like you're slogging through the game, just, polishing up the animations, polishing up the actions, speeding everything up, getting rid of the freaking load times. I am told, that even I was playing the PC version, but I'm told that if you have the PS3 PSN version, it's still slogging load times throughout the course of the game. It's like, come on. There's just so much you could do to really polish the gameplay and make it more like, say, I can't think of the name of the game. The game that is in opposition to Diablo 3. I can't think of the name of it. Or Torchlight 2, or Diablo 3, add all the conveniences of UI and functionality and, of course, smoothness of actual gameplay that modern games have, and that would really help open up this game. And this is why I mention it, this is the final reason I mention it's hard to recommend this game. It's convoluted, of course, it's an unfinished series, and the gameplay is a big barrier to entry. I actually really did not like replaying this game at all. And before you hate on me for that, I just want, again, to defend myself. My friend Pax, who is way bigger of a fan of this franchise than I am, years ago he went back to replay Blood Omen, and he still was like, oh god, this is just such a terrible game to slog through. So I'm glad to know it's not just me. It is in many ways like replaying Diablo 1. That is exactly the impression I had, and it's like, well, there's some definite nostalgia there, and it's worth it. You know, there's something there. There's meat on those bones, but it's like, oh, having to slog through to get to it. So let's go ahead and move on back to the story thing. One of the interesting things about this story to me is that it's basically the fantasy version of Warhammer 40k. No, I don't mean Warhammer Fantasy. I actually don't know if Warhammer Fantasy is like this. I know almost nothing about Warhammer Fantasy. What I do know is that if I was to picture Warhammer 40k in a fantasy setting, it would basically be this. In other words, everything is screwed forever. This is definitely a definition of a crapsack world. We've got the 3 original races who are basically toys for the EG. I'm going to call them that from now on, by the way. Because I got tired of writing out Elder God constantly on my notes, because he comes up constantly in my notes. So I just started abbreviating it EG. So that's what EG means, okay? Elder God, just making that clear. So, you know, all the machinations that happen and result in the original vampires, or however you're supposed to pronounce that. The ancient vampires fighting against the Hilden, and the humans are kind of caught in the middle, but then the humans start up the Sarafin Empire, and they just kind of go for their own thing, and then the humans hate the new vampires, not the old vampires, and then Kain's Empire shows up, and everything goes to hell, and the corruption from the pillars seeps into everything, and this is a world that was doomed from the get-go. That is admittedly part of the point. The writers said that they wanted to make a game in which there were no good guys and there were no bad guys. There was just people and differing perspectives and differing viewpoints. There is actually, in my opinion, one exception in this entire game to someone who is just definitively, absolutely, and horribly evil, unremittingly terrible creature, and that is the EG himself, the Elder God. Which I want to talk about very quickly here. The pillars corrupting the world doesn't actually make a lot of sense to me. It could be explained away. I always hoped that at some point they would explain why corrupting the corruption of the pillars corrupted the world, because the pillars don't have anything to do with the world. Not really. The pillars were constructed as a lock on the seal to make sure that the hilden stay away. That's it. So why do the pillars lock? Is that just because the demon world is seeping into the material plane? Is it because the pillars had become so tied into the world thanks to their nature as magical pillars? Is it because of something the Elder God's doing? I don't know. I can only theorize on that. And I also wonder about the Elder God's motivations, the EG's motivations, and what he's thinking and why. And maybe he literally just has inscrutable motivations. I mean, is Raziel correct, for example? Is he literally just another vampire who is leeching parasitically off of life and death? Or does he have some other motivation? Is this whole corruption of everything something he wanted? Keep in mind, by the way, that the events of the entire game, the entire history of this world, basically were kicked into motion by the Elder God. Because the Elder God, the ancient vampires worshipped, just lavishly worshipped the Elder God. And the Hilden were like, no. And that started everything right there. And I find that fascinating in its own right, because at first, you just kind of accept that on the face of it, right? And then Raziel accidentally purifies, I think it's Mobius in particular. I actually don't remember. Was it Mobius? Oh, I can't remember. I think it was Mobius who was purified by Raziel. It's in defiance. And then the Mobius sees the Elder God as he actually is for the first time and is horrified. Keep in mind, this is someone, if it was Mobius, forgive me if I'm remembering the wrong person, but this person was a fanatical devotee of the Elder God until he actually saw what it was. And then he was like, oh my God, what is this thing? And that was the first moment. That was probably the biggest moment of, oh my God, in the entire series for me. Because all of a sudden everything fits and makes sense. Because no one knew, except for Raziel, what the Elder God was actually like. They couldn't actually perceive it. And there's so many possibilities there. Maybe they were perceiving some heavenly light or some beatific creature or whatever. Something that just spoke to them as this perfect, beautiful, amazing deity was in fact just this horrible, evil, disgusting thing voiced by... Oh my gosh, I can't remember his name. He sadly has passed away. He was a brilliant Shakespearean actor, and an amazing job of voicing the Elder God. I actually used to be able to do a pretty good impression of that voice myself. Can't anymore. More of that good voice acting thing. Simon Templeman, of course, amazing. But that makes me think, when we go back to the original thing that started off, the Hilden and the ancient vampires, or the vampires, or whatever. Maybe, see, let me segue this. Keep that in mind just for a second. Let's just segue this for a second. One of the things that I have been questioned, that fans of the series have questioned before, and I've seen whole discussion threads about that, is, were the Hilden evil? Now, for the course of most of the game, and indeed this is true even in Blood Omen, the Hilden are very clearly shown as horribly evil creatures. I mean, the Hilden, the Dark One, the guy who took over Morthimus? The bad guy one, who is a major recurring character throughout the course of the game, he is pretty clearly, and yet at the same time, it's hard to call him distinctly evil, thanks to the nature of the game, since what he's after is benefit for his people and releasing them from the demon land and all that fun stuff. And we know that being in the demon land has an effect on you, especially if you're there for a while, like the Hilden have been. But, see, the thing is, one of the biggest points of evidence that is usually said for the Hilden not being evil is the fact that they rejected the Elder God. But remember, nobody really knew what the Elder God actually was until Raziel got into the mix. So, is it not entirely possible that what happened was the Hilden were hideously evil and were rejecting what they believed to be a good and benevolent deity because they were horrible? And this actually makes a lot of sense, because if you look out through the course of the series, Raziel often does the wrong thing for the right reasons. But Kain himself, the titular character, actually usually does the right thing for completely the wrong reasons. And this theme is something that's present in many aspects of the games. So it makes sense to me that the Hilden would have actually been evil from the beginning. We're bad, we're not a good race, we're not a good people, and we're just rejecting what they believed to be benevolence, when in fact it obviously wasn't. And I mean, God, the whole ritualizing the firstborn children blood thing, that's just, no. Messed up stuff. Tossing them into the pit, But getting back to the game in particular, like I said, I have so many questions about the EG, the Elder God, and that will never be answered at this point. And I have a note here that says, was the Elder God right? Because he makes this statement that, vampires are the curse of the world. That the fact that they cannot return to the wheel means they're wrong, and therefore that they should not exist, and that all vampires should be wiped out. And a lot of the EG's motivations is in wiping out the vampire curse. And yet, the Elder God is known to be a hell of a liar many, many times, and to pretty much be completely only interested in cursing himself. So, motivations, thought processes there, just speculation. Let's get back to something more relevant to Blood Omen in particular. Because if I'm not mistaken, most of you who've just played this first game or are looking for Rumination just on the first game are saying, who the hell's the Elder God? It is interesting to me. I mentioned this already. The pillars are presented throughout the course of this game as the pillars of creation, like they are the founding thing upon which all reality sits. And again, this kind of ties into the whole corruption thing that happens later. But they're not. As I already discussed, they are just the lock and key on the demon realm to make sure the Hilden stay out. I find that fascinating, especially since it's so indicative of the style of writing that this series has. So much of the Legacy of Kain series rests on lack of information or deliberate misinformation. And I don't really mean on behalf of the writers so much as I mean behalf on the characters. Kain himself is basically being manipulated by everyone all the time, always, and so is Raziel. Both of the main characters share that facet of the fact that they are pawns of everyone, and in many cases, even knowing that they are pawns doesn't really seem to change anything. But I don't want to get into Kain just yet. I do, however, want to talk about one other thing here really quick about some of the other side characters. I don't actually have that much to share here. It's a good game. I do recommend it. I do absolutely recommend you play this. Ariel is an interesting character to me because she reminds me in many ways of Azura over in Elder Scrolls. She is often portrayed, or to make this more clear, she often portrays herself as a beneficial, I'm here to help you kind of character, but she's not. Azura is extremely manipulative, extremely conniving, and really only cares about whatever she cares about. That, in many cases, coincides with things that benefit humanity, more mortal races and whatnot in Elder Scrolls. And it's kind of the same thing with Ariel. Her whims and justifications do kind of coincide with things that would be considered beneficial, but she is still manipulating Kain from the moment she first meets him. It actually is kind of upsetting, though. I don't think she got what she deserved. Just my take on it. I don't think she deserved to sit there and watch the rise of Kain's empire, and then the fall of Kain's empire, and then the destruction of everything as the world slowly slips into rot. But nevertheless, she is not a good person. She is probably one of the better examples of the no good, no evil characters, because and some people would argue with me on this, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this, as I always do, because I've heard some people say that Ariel was actually a good person. She just had to accept doing these manipulative things, doing these Machiavellian things, lying, in order to accomplish a greater good. And I would actually counter, or I should say respond, that's actually a good point, but that just kind of emphasizes the point. In my opinion, that's not good, that's neutral leaning towards good. I know that sounds like a technically, but that's more of a gradient. In other words, she might be the most good character in the overall franchise, and that says something about it. Just like we've talked about in The Witcher, just like we talked about in Game of Thrones, just like we've talked about in Warhammer 40k. When you're in a horrible setting, the most good you can ever be is someone who does unpleasant or bad things in order to accept that it might be for the greater good. It is also worth noting, although this enters the realm of speculation, that Ariel might not have been motivated by, the good of all the world, restoring the world to proper balance, even though that was kind of her shtick. Keeping in mind, the balance she is referring to would mean human domination of the planet, the extermination of the vampires, the permanent sealing on the Hilden, therefore ensuring that humanity would rise triumphant. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't point out, she was also self-motivated, because she wanted to go free. Not that I blame her on that. Lord knows she had a sorry lot to begin with. And of course, all of this was put in motion by the Hilden, so I mean, and so then we move on. Let's talk about Mortemius. I don't know why I have such a hard time saying his name. He's an interesting character because he also strikes me as a character who is leaning towards good, and yet at the same time, remember that this person is someone who, as I kind of hinted at before, willingly participated in murder and blood sacrifices in order to appease a fake god. This wasn't even the Elder God, who himself is probably a fake god, but I'm talking about the frickin' Hilden. He was effectively worshipping the Hilden. It's like, yes, kill children, kill babies, go, babies on spikes, except it was done with sincerity. This man is messed up, and he had no problem doing these horrible acts, and he has no problem doing horrible acts. It's just the fact that he was being mind-controlled to do even more horrible acts. That's why this whole setting is just like a morass of gray, with some shadings of darker gray and some shadings of lighter gray, because he was, in many ways, a victim. But that doesn't make him a good guy, does it? And that's actually an interesting parallel into Mobius, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a manipulator himself. Again, I love the fact that he set up a trap that only his past self could act upon. I don't know if I can properly explain how mind-breakingly, horrifyingly just that is, because you would have to know the point at which in your past that you were already setting up this trap to be in position, and then move the character back into that past, knowing that his interaction with your past self will change what your past self experienced. You see how this kind of works? Because what ended up happening here is, to explain this a little bit, the way that time travel works here is his past self always was interacting with William the Just, right, the boy king. and gave him the soul blade. And there's two ways to look at this. Either there was no Kain, or Kain shows up but nothing happens. I ascribe to the former, because remember, you can change history. You can change the timeline in this particular setting. It's not time as a linear line, okay? So he gives him the blade, and all these things that he knew he was going to do in preparation for this eventual trap. Then 50 years pass as he slowly turns William the Just into the Nemesis and leads the righteous human armies on a conquest of the entire planet. Human domination again. Then, after engineering this whole thing, he portrays himself as this oracle who tries to guide Kain into going back to then, so that he can give him, the sword, so that, or not give him the sword, I'm saying that wrong, so that he can interact with his past self, changing the timeline, because time is like, paradox, no, no, no. And that leads to the situation in William the Just is now murdered, and now past Mobius, who already knew about this plan because of the way he thinks and the way he perceives the future, is like, now it's time to begin phase 2. The funny thing about all of this is, Mobius is... he's probably the most Machiavellian individual in the whole setting, with the possible exception of the Elder God himself. This is also not the last time we encounter Mobius. But his overall plot is one of those I win or I win situations. If the Nemesis just conquered the world, then that's the end of the vampires, and he wins. He gets what he wants. If he goes back in time and starts the martyrdom war, then all of the vampires are wiped out by a holy crusade, and he gets what he wants. That brings me to point B. Mobius, it's hard for me to describe Mobius as true evil for the same reason it is for everyone else, because while he is certainly not a good person, he is ultimately just motivated by his own hatred of vampires. His despising, his rancid disgust at them, especially Vorador in particular, and his hatred of Vorador and what Vorador thinks of him and his kind, and the idea that I've always got that impression, and forgive me if this was confirmed somewhere, I don't recall if it ever was though, I always got this impression that Mobius looked at vampires like Vorador and how they would portray themselves as superior to humankind, and said, no, and in a contrarian sort of a way, wanted to prove that the humans, the inferior species, could overwhelm the superior one. And then C, the third reason I find this whole Mobius manipulation thing amusing is it says something for the man's patience, that he's willing to wait for these lengthy periods of time to make his plans come into fruition. And of course he's got that staff. Where's your heart? Well, Malik. Now, I don't actually have that much to talk about Malik. Malik and Vorador both kind of go hand in hand. Let's talk about Malik first, because he is this, paladin, crusader. Oh, humanity's cause is my cause, loyal to the council. It is interesting because he never actually failed the council. In fact, the council basically relied on him probably a little bit too much. He was basically a crutch for the council. He is basically a very skilled, very driven, very competent warrior, and later wraith. And I'm just going to pause there. But he does strike me as very youthful, youthful in his mentality, youthful in his personality, not actually young, but someone who is still brash and impetuous, right? Then we talk about Vorador. Now, he is probably the closest thing to a typical vampire we see in general, but especially in Blood Omen. He is someone who, as I mentioned before, is like, we are above them. He actually refers to humankind as cattle. And thinks of them as something that you don't interact with unless you're going to feed. He does still have some shadings to him, of course, due to what happened to his wife and children and the rest of his family and friends. It's kind of understandable that he just kind of distanced himself from that kind of thing now. It's funny because he's constantly portrayed as this disgusting hedonist, and yet in many ways, he is himself just as much of a victim as so many other characters in this setting are. And then when a couple of time paradoxes later, his personality completely changes. To my knowledge, there's no actual explanation for why his personality went the way it did in the final timeline, the one we see in Defiance. I was hoping that would be something that would be followed through on, but whatever. But what do these characters have to do with each other? Vorador and Malik, this is probably saying something kind of obvious, so forgive me, but Vorador and Malik are both two sides of Kain's coin. Both of them are an insight into his personality and his perspective. Kain himself, I don't want to talk about him just yet. Let's stop. But, so on the Malik side of things, we see that youthful, impetuous, brash arrogance, and we see his desire to strive for humanity. He is basically the human side of Kain. And on Vorador, we see the vampire side of Kain, and his drive towards sitting at the top of the heap. You know, the ambition, the conquest, the different type of arrogance. This is more, as opposed to this, which is, I can do anything. This is more, I am better than anything. So this actually is probably more arrogance, and this one's a little more pride. And we see these two things, and as we interact with Malik and Vorador, a decent amount as we go through Blood Omen. And of course, that's supposed to represent Kain's overall struggle. It is interesting to me because Kain is actually, in many ways, repulsed by Vorador, and yet at the same time intrigued. This is something that I could become, and let's be blunt, when Kain's Empire, to my knowledge it's never named, so I just call it Kain's Empire. When Kain's Empire is founded, that's basically where he goes, until he realizes that that's not actually working the way he wanted it to, and then he kind of goes in a different direction. That's getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about the final thing I want to talk about, actually, believe it or not. First of all, let's talk about, well, we're talking about Kain. Why I like Kain as a character. Simon Templeman. That's it. Rumination over. No, seriously though, Simon Templeman is a brilliant voice actor. Some of you who haven't played this game or have no real interest in it, you might know him as Tyrn Logain over in Dragon Age. He's also done a decent amount of other work for BioWare in general, and he is also a theater actor. And he's good. He's great with his voice. I would kill to be as good as a voice. Well, no, I wouldn't, but I would drink a Canada Dry to be as good of a voice actor as he is. He's really good. He absolutely nails the role. And to be perfectly blunt, if it was not for the constant narration and presence of Simon Templeman, I probably never would have played through this game even back when it came out. It was still kind of a back in the day. The second reason I like Kain as a character is he is a complex character. We see throughout the course of the series, but even in this game, we see him develop and evolve from this not innocent, but like naive, ignorant idiot, basically. And then we see him slowly grow into being, you know, more of that impetuous, brash youth thing that we see in Malik. And then we see him kind of slowly devolving into more of a selfish person. And we see all different aspects of his personality. If I was to summarize his character, this is funny, I would say that his character can't be summarized. Now, the ideal in writing is for all characters to be like that. To make a character that you can't put a bullet point on, or a couple of bullet points on, or you can't summarize with a sentence. That's always the ideal from character design in writing. But practicality and reality usually disagree with that. So usually, what you'll do as a writer, what many writers will do, is they'll pick one character, or one small group of characters, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever, and those will be the characters that are fully fleshed out, complex, complicated, can't be summarized characters. It's debatable how many characters in the Legacy of Kain fall into that. In my opinion, Kain himself is the only one who is truly a non-summarizable character. We see so many different aspects of his personality. We see him do things that are kind of illogical. We see him do things that would be considered against character, because he is basically a person at that point. The way he's being written is a fully fleshed out individual. And it's logical to see him be like, power, I don't actually want power anymore, but then this, or maybe not this, or maybe I'm going to do this instead. He is a fully realized character. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why this series has had such an impact on me and remains in the back of my mind even all these years later. And one of the reasons it still bothers me that the series isn't finished, because I liked the Legacy of Kain series. It just never went anywhere. So I don't have much else to add about Kain as a character, because all I could do is tell you his things and what he does. There's so much there. There's so much meat to his characterization. Let me check my notes really quick here. I mean, we see in him someone who actually portrays himself as wizened, and yet at the same time foolish. We see in him someone who is ambitious, and yet weak. Someone who is prideful, and yet self-loathing. He has a lot of different characteristics to him. And it was a perfect a decision to make him the main character throughout most of the game. Of course, Raziel takes another place of that. It is interesting to me, of course, finally, that the one truly fleshed out, truly complicated, really, really, really well done character in the Legacy of Kain series is one of the two that is perceived as little more than a pawn by everyone else. That amuses me because, on the one hand, they generally succeed at every maneuvering on the board pretty much right up until they don't. Because of Raziel, because of Raziel's actions, Kain is finally granted the ability to finally actually act in defiance of fate, which is one of the undercurrent themes of the whole series, that you can't escape fate. In fact, it's implied, although never outright stated, that the only being in the entire setting who has free will at all is Raziel. Everyone else is adherent to fate and to the machinations thereof, and that Raziel then gifts that, basically, to Kain at the end of Defiance, leading to the cliffhanger ending. But Kain himself, like, I don't know what else. I don't know what else to add to that. I think I'm just going to cut that off there before I just get into the rambling mode. Ramble. Good game. I recommend it. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time, guys.